This week on The Sceptic, I speak to David Shipley on Baroness Casey's bombshell grooming gang's rapid audit and the prospects for a national inquiry, plus Islamism in the Home Office.
I didn't know that the civil service Muslim network existed until this story broke. It's really concerning. I don't think we should have groups of co-religionists plotting to oppose government policy.
Tom Jones, writer and Conservative councillor, on what the Ballymena riots in Northern Ireland say about the fractious state of multicultural Britain.
It's increasingly difficult, actually, to see a way out of this situation. I think it's quite frightening. I think we are certainly heading for a significant civil breakdown.
And for our premium subscribers, I speak to Ben Pyle on the alarmism around dimming the sun, a mad crusade for solar panels in Britain, and why the public has stopped buying the Green Fanatics narrative.
I think there's a much greater recognition that the green agenda has really harmed European industries. I wonder whether there is something in the water in Westminster that dissolves people's capacity for basic arithmetic.
Hello and welcome to episode 41 of The Sceptic, the Daily Sceptic's weekly podcast. I'm your host, Laurie Wastell, an associate editor at the Daily Sceptic. And joining me this week is friend of the show and Daily Sceptic regular, David Shipley, who is a writer on prisons, crime and justice.
Great to be back.
Yeah, good to have you. A lot to talk about this week, but we're going to be focused on the bombshell report that has finally dropped this week from Baroness Louise Casey, which is her rapid audit into the grooming gangs. And I suppose let's get into the history of how that came about in a second, and sort of the Labour's politics, and whether they have now, of course, called for a national inquiry first. We'll get into that later. But in some ways, this was repeating things we already knew. But nevertheless, there were some important revelations in that report, and you've written about this week. What was your reaction to reading it when it came out on Monday?
Yeah, I think you're right. A lot of what was in the Casey report had been published before, and I think those of us who have followed the issue were aware of it, but what this has done is place it in front of audiences that hadn't considered it before. And I think it was very powerful to get all of this information in one place in such a clear way. One new detail that really stood out to me, though, was where Casey talks about the fact that she had sight of ongoing police investigations into group-based child sexual abuse. And she indicates that there's a very high representation amongst the people being investigated for these crimes of asylum seekers and foreign nationals.
A significant proportion is the word she used.
Yes, is the phrase she uses. And that, I think, is particularly incendiary. And I think that's perhaps one of the reasons that the government moved so quickly over the weekend, once it had sight of the report, to start briefing that they were going to have an inquiry, that they were going to act on this, there were going to be new criminal investigations. Because really what that shows is that the current British asylum and migration policy is directly causing the rape of children. And that's, in really plain terms, what is happening. I know that sounds perhaps inflammatory, but it's simply true. We are pursuing an asylum policy and a migration policy which places a very large number of clearly very dangerous men with a high propensity to commit sexual assault and rape into communities where they are targeting vulnerable young children. And just today, in fact, I think the Centre for Migration Control has managed to get hold of some data looking at how significantly overrepresented foreign nationals are in sexual assault offences in this country. So this is a real live issue. This isn't historic, grooming gangs from 20 years ago that we need to put this issue to bed on. This is something that is happening now and continuing to happen and will continue to happen. So I think that's very incendiary, and that's the detail that really stood out to me. I think also what is quite interesting is that I don't believe the government thought this was going to end up in them having to do a national inquiry. And I don't think Louise Casey went into it expecting to make that recommendation. And the reason I say that is if you look at the things the government and ministers and Labour MPs were saying as recently as a couple of months ago, they were being very, very hostile to the idea of even discussing this issue. And the PM labelled it as a far-right dog whistle. We've had the phrase dog whistle used by other Labour figures in just the last few weeks. So I don't believe they expected they would have to do this. And what is quite interesting, if you look at what Casey writes in the report and what she's said in interviews since, it's very clear. I think that she became quite radicalised by looking into this detail. She's recounted one situation in which she was looking at a physical record of a crime and saw that someone had physically Tipexed over the word Pakistani, and she physically removed the Tipex and saw that word had been obscured. And she's realised, I think, that there's been this collective effort amongst all these different organs of the state to cover up and hide and refuse to engage with these horrific crimes for decades. And that, clearly because she's a fundamentally immoral person, has awakened in her this absolute certainty that there has to be a national inquiry, that has to be dealt with.
And I mean, you mentioned Labour's positioning on this. Of course, they've tried to get out ahead of it by calling that inquiry before the report even dropped. But as you say, they've come out basically against this for the past 6 months. And in fact, as Kemi Badenoch made the point when that report was delivered, they've voted against amendments that the Conservatives have put forward to force a national inquiry 3 times, and with all that rhetoric as well. And so, I mean, this already looks very, very bad for them, damaging politically. But do you have a sense of what it is that's changed their mind? Is it just that there's no way they could now not listen to someone like Louise Casey, because they have really a sense that she is an independent expert who they've held up to be this voice, and now they have to listen to her?
I think that's part of it, yeah. There's a particular legalism, I think, especially from the Prime Minister. We see this where in the Supreme Court decision on trans and what sex means, as soon as the Supreme Court changed the rules, Keir Starmer had always believed the rules, and his whole opinion's flipped overnight. And I think that process-focused, legalistic mind means he's I would suspect, constitutionally incapable of doing anything other than accepting the recommendations of the Casey review. So, and also fundamentally, in having set up this review, if they then rejected the findings, I think there would be outrage and almost certainly significant civil disorder. The review is very clear about the scale and the horror of what has happened.
And I think it's worth reminding ourselves of how the paucity of what had been on offer. It was going to be these 5 locally led so-called inquiries, but actually that turned into merely locally led work. Only one of the places had been named, that was Oldham, and the amount of money that was offered for it was a paltry 5 million. I mean, they really did not want to do this.
Well, actually, in fact, it's even more than that. They were not required to conduct these mini inquiries or pieces of work. Local authorities could decide if they wanted to or not. And given the very obvious complicity and culpability of councils in this offending, in the sustaining of this offending, in the covering up of this offending, that you clearly can't trust them to check on their own work. I mean, they're part of the problem, and the inquiry needs to be examining local councillors, council employees, social workers, and the police in all these areas in order to figure out who is guilty and who is responsible.
And so Labour have been forced into this to some extent, and for some survivors, they see this as a small but significant win, in that, finally the government does seem to be taking this at least more seriously than they have been. But at the same time, there is, I think, a lot of nervousness of what will the terms of the inquiry be, of course, and is it going to drag on for a very long time? Is it going to be another opportunity to essentially sweep this issue under the rug? So, I mean, yeah, you're illustrating a bit there, but what does it need to focus on so that it actually gets the right results?
Sure. So Casey speaks to a bit of this. She says that it needs to deliver relatively quickly. It needs to have statutory powers. I think you're absolutely right. We need to see what the terms are and also who is appointed to lead it. And I think I'll deal with those two issues separately. So the terms, I think, need to ensure that this inquiry has the power to go wherever the evidence leads. It has to have the legal authority to compel testimony and to force the release of evidence. And it needs to be unrestrained in terms of where it goes within the public sector. We need to not just focus on the fact that, groups of men, mostly Pakistani Mapuris, who are, usually in quite close kin groups, were gang raping children for decades. That all of those men need to be found and punished, and I think where possible they should have their residency rights or citizenship stripped and be deported after their punishment. In some ways, what I think is worse, though, is the culpability of public servants. All those social workers who covered things up or were complicit in the abuse and rape of children, all the council employees and councillors who kept things quiet, hid things. In some cases, councils, directly tried to block the publication of details of cases. One police force talked about the local authority, telling them not to publish the fact that they'd secured convictions against one of these gangs. Every single one of those public servants, to my mind, is guilty of an appalling betrayal of their job, of their moral duties as a person as well, and of their fellow British citizens. And I think we need to have an inquiry which leads to substantial and significant prosecutions of those people. And really, ultimately, those prosecutions, when they result in convictions, also need to produce exemplary punishments which will ensure that nothing like this ever happens again. And I think this would need presumably further primary legislation, but we should seek to ensure that the reputations of those people are ruined, I think, and that they are financially ruined. So yes, there should be prison sentences, but also I think taking away public sector pensions, taking away honours, making sure that these individuals are named, that it's very public what they have done. There are tools, I think, which are pretty extreme, really, but this is such an extreme crime against the people of this country that I think they are necessary to demonstrate our rage at this, and that to make it absolutely certain this won't happen again. So I think the inquiry needs to have a lot of teeth. Particularly some of those local councillors and some of these councils may well now be in Parliament, they may well be in other key public roles. People will have been promoted in the last decades. The inquiry needs to be able to go as high and as far as it needs to. And my personal preference would be something more like a Royal Commission, which is, once begun, essentially impossible for the government to stop. Because it is begun by letters patent, and it therefore is more free to act. But a very robust statutory inquiry could also work. So I think that's what the terms of the inquiry need to be. It needs to be free to go where it wants. The other issue is who leads it. And I don't think it should be a Brit. This is a catastrophic failure of the establishment. This is, essentially over decades, huge parts of the British establishment, the British regime, have ensured that it made it clear really that they preferred children to be raped than to, as they might see it, stir up the far right, give ammunition to the far right, acknowledge the actual reality of what was going on. And I think that broadly distributed complicity means that someone from within the establishment might find it quite difficult to lead this inquiry. I think my preference would be to find a judge from somewhere else in the Anglosphere, someone who doesn't need to worry about how they're received at parties in London, but will do what needs to be done.
Absolutely. And you mentioned councillors and MPs and things like that. And obviously there's police and social services and those questions over them. But one thing that Dominic Cummings in particular has been raising recently is the complicity of Whitehall perhaps in this. And of course, it includes basically trying to judicially review some of the findings of Andrew Norfolk back in 2011 and 12 so that they wouldn't come out. And this is being the journalist who has died recently, but who really blew the lid off the scandal massively back then. And we wouldn't be having this conversation the same way now if it were not for him. And I mean, that's just extraordinary. But in fact, it does seem that this week, both Kemi Badenoch has said the inquiry should follow the evidence wherever it leads. And Keir Starmer seems to have opened the doors to that possibility as well. I mean, so is that something that could happen? Do you think they could be going after Whitehall civil servants?
It absolutely needs to, yes. And I think there are even more recent examples, that perhaps are slightly less egregious, but the relatively recent Home Office report, which tried to essentially say there was nothing to see here.
Well, that's right, yes. So it's the 2020 report. And in that report, there's this claim that ended up being very widely repeated, which is that essentially this type of offending was not disproportionate to racial groups, essentially. And in Baroness Casey's recent report, I mean, and that is unbelievable how much that has been cited, by the way, that claim, which is essentially false.
But it is false. I think there's no.
Yeah.
It's very clear that it's entirely untrue.
Yeah, it's partly a fudge and it's partly just untrue. But what she says is very, very unequivocal. She says this does not, unequivocal for a bureaucrat, let's say, but she says this does not seem to be evidence in research or data, which is basically it's total rubbish. And yet this has been used by so many people to sort of deny about this since 2020. I mean, it's just extraordinary.
It is, and this was produced by the Home Office and published. And, there are two explanations, really. Either those people who wrote it knew they were lying, and they did it for what they perhaps perceived to be noble reasons, or they're clueless and so blinded by their assumptions about criminality and assumptions about society that they were unable to actually look at the facts. In either case, they are clearly unfit. And there's a point at which incompetence and malice are essentially indistinguishable in terms of their outcome, right? And this is it. It doesn't really matter why they produced that report. Either way, people like that should not be holding any public office. And I think the inquiry needs to go into the Home Office, potentially into other departments as well. But I think the Home Office is the key one that needs to be hauled over the coals.
And I mean, it's testament to how much that was used as essentially misinformation about it. So when Suella Braverman, quite bravely, partly responding to GB News reporting about this in 2023, was talking about this being a specifically Pakistani Muslim heritage community problem, she was raked over hot coals for that. And in particular, it was only a month after that she was actually fired by Rishi Sunak. But there was an ipso ruling which said that her comments about this were false and inaccurate. I mean, it's just extraordinary.
Yeah, and I saw today that Suella's now pushing Ipso to apologise and retract that, and rightly so. And I think there's so much in this whole scandal which I think destroys the legitimacy of the British state. The preparedness to lie, the preparedness to cover up, the sort of sacrificing of human life on this altar of multiculturalism. And there's also this very clear willingness to just produce fake information. This same state that lectures about disinformation, that is so keen to say that other people are lying, just produces lies. And I think that is when we realise that those who the administrative state and those who rule over us are willing to lie about things that are so important, because they don't trust us with the truth, because they thought the truth would be, provocative, that people would be angry about the truth, so they can't have it. I don't think people like that have any right to rule.
And of course, in that section, that comes rather in the section on denial, of which there's an entire chapter devoted to it. And so a lot of that comes from that report, but there's a lot of other things as well. But one sort of example of this tendency, which has been basically to say anyone talking about this issue is racist, etc., etc. Notable one is Emily Maitlis, who just, I think, last month was lecturing Rupert Lowe, who of course has set up his own grooming gangs inquiry, and saying that the only reason he was interested in this was because he's racist, and that, in fact, citing that Home Office report, that it's not even an issue anyway. I mean, these people have so much egg on their faces, to say the least, but it doesn't really seem like there's ever going to be an act of of contrition from them and saying, oh, actually, I got this wrong, because it seems like they're still carrying on with the same thing.
I think that's true. Although I think it's also quite interesting to see on LBC yesterday, there was a phone-in about this. A lot of people phoning in. And LBC is not traditionally open to maybe sort of an argument you might find on the Sceptic or on GB News about these issues. But, caller after caller was furious, distressed, and not holding back. And I hope that some of the presenters took some moments to reflect about the fact they'd got it wrong. I suspect what will happen is what is very much human nature. A lot of people will memory hole ever believed anything different and move on, because confronting the fact that we've been so wrong and done so much harm by being so wrong is difficult. And I suppose I do feel some sympathy with that, but I think they need to have the moral courage to own it.
It's clear the report is going to change a lot of thinking on this, I think. But let's get back into some of the details of that then, because one of the issues that has always been, related to this, and people have always really known is part of the problem here, is the question of taxis and taxi firms basically at times taking these girls from their care home, for instance, to be abused in houses and these essential, prostitution dens and things like this. And that question of taxi licensing and of being much more robust about that has been brought in the report. What did you make of that? I mean, it's interesting to finally see that be coming to light.
First of all, I would challenge the use of the word prostitution in this context. These are... and I think it's very easy to slip into that language because it was used a lot. But actually, these are young girls who are being raped. And often the police were using expressions. This has been reported labeling as sort of little slags. These kind of horrible terms. And I think it's it was not that. It was the kind of organised abuse and rape of children. And absolutely, it's clear that in a lot of these communities, the taxi driver networks are central to the offending, both in terms of how these girls are collected, transported around, but also there seem to be networks amongst the taxi drivers participating in the rape and abuse. I know one campaign that's being looked at is that there should be cameras in taxis. That may make some difference to safety. I'm not opposed to it on principle, but I think if you look at most of this sort of offending, it wasn't necessarily happening in the taxis. It was, as you said, it was being done in houses that were often collectively rented by these kin groups of men.
Yes, and I mean that is an important point you raise about the terminology here and the understanding of these girls that Baroness Casey also did, and she uses this term adultification, but it's basically thinking about them as if it's as if somehow the fact that she said it doesn't matter because what there's no acceptable reason for that. But I think that was a very important part of the report. But for instance, one of the things that has flowed from that is the fact that many of the sentences for some of these men who have essentially raped a child is not necessarily for the appropriate offence. It's something like having sex with a minor or child prostitution, and two of those offences have got things like 30-month sentence, which is just ridiculous. Yes. But we need a whole sea change in how we see this, don't we?
We do, and Casey, to her credit, talks a lot about this. I think the idea that in law in this country, a much older adult man can go and have sex with a 13 or 14-year-old girl, and it can be treated somehow as if she consented and it's fine, and therefore, as you said, the sentencing is much, much lower, is appalling. And it's good that the government has accepted the recommendation to change that law, and I think that is a really excellent thing. And you saw this attitude, this adultification, in one story that sticks out to me from all these horrors, is the social worker who signed off on a underage girl moving in with her abuser, and the social worker actually attended an Islamic marriage ceremony in which the girl was married to her abuser, and the social services in that particular local area were comfortable with this. And that's what I mean when I talk about complicity. I mean, this is not just people who turned a blind eye or people who felt a little bit awkward about the race of the of the rapist. This is people who actively facilitated this abuse when their professional and moral duties were the exact opposite.
And so before we move on, one final question on how this has been received then. Of course, many have rightly just said we must accept what's been said and get on with it, finding the answers and finding the culprits. But of course, there are still some people popping up and saying, well, what about the Pakistani community? Essentially, we mustn't demonize people and things like this. Do you think there's been sufficient sort of acceptance more broadly that this is a problem with a very specific community? I mean, one final thing on this is I saw an article today pointing out that this term that the BBC, for instance, used, which is Asian grooming gangs, is really quite misleading. And it's not, these are not Chinese gangs, these are not even Indian gangs. It's a very specific community. I mean, are we able to focus enough on that without saying, oh no, this is a terrible thing to say?
I think there's a squeamishness, isn't there? And you see that in the term grooming gangs as well, which is entirely euphemistic. These are kin group child rape gangs. That's what they are. And you're absolutely right. They're primarily Mapuris. There are, I think there have been Afghan groups and Somali groups as well. So it's not all Mapuris, but it is mostly. And I think there does still seem to be a squeamishness, an unwillingness to actually describe what has happened and is happening. And I noticed this use of Asian as a very vague descriptor, which I think if I was a Southeast Asian person living in this country, I might feel slightly, put out by if I was Vietnamese or Chinese and was unfairly being suggested that I might be part of this problem. I think we should all try to drive a culture on this, and more broadly, where we just speak with clear honesty about stuff. I think we can't let squeamishness or embarrassment or discomfort with using particular words deter us. It's quite interesting. I was at an academic conference in Swansea when this report was published, and so I was talking to other academics there. And there's one academic from Australia who was talking to me about issues with sexual violence that she had worked on in Australia. And she said there were times when she was in meetings and people just couldn't say the word rape. And they were so squeamish they weren't. And she said, you cannot confront and solve these issues until you are able to actually name them and be honest about them. And I think as part of the process of revealing all of this properly and confronting it as a country, and ultimately, I hope, healing from it, we do have to start being really honest. And I think it's a good thing if those of us who feel comfortable with being blunt about this stuff, try to encourage those who feel less comfortable and help them to see the benefits of being honest.
Yes. Okay, so let's move on to, a related story. I mean, a question is, how will this kind of thing go down in Whitehall, in particular in the corridors of power? And you've been writing this week on this, quite bizarre revelations from the Times. In fact, they came out last year, but about the civil service Muslim network and one particular member who made some seemingly anti-Semitic comments on a Zoom call. And tell us a bit about that story and what you think the significance of it is.
It's a great question. I didn't know that the civil service Muslim network existed until this story broke, and I suspect many people outside of the civil service probably didn't either. And it was originally published last year by the Times, and they had obtained the transcripts of a number of Zoom calls, which were hosted by Sami Rahman, who's at the time apparently the head of the civil service Muslim network. And this is an official body, so it has civil service recognition. It exists within Whitehall, and it is a cross-departmental body which brings together Muslims to advocate for various things. It's got a page on the civil service website. You can read the things it's striving to do, and one of its key goals is to ensure that Muslim civil servants feel respected, which is an interesting word, I always think. And because people's definition of what it requires them to be respected does vary quite a lot. And there are other networks like this. There is a Hindu network, there's a Jewish network, there are LGBT networks, there's a group for women, there's a sort of race group more broadly. And these networks all exist to allow and facilitate this contact between civil servants. And I think initially, when this Times report was first came out, it suggested that Sami Rahman had said things which seemed to be anti-Semitic, including referring to Israel as shaitan, which is Arabic for Satan, and also that, and I think more disturbingly, that he was talking to the attendees of this group about how they could influence and oppose government policy. And that is really concerning. I don't think we should have groups of co-religionists plotting to oppose government policy. I don't actually think civil servants should do any opposing of government policy. I think that they should be a machine for executing the will of the democratic government. And I think what's quite interesting, as I looked into this story, I went and spoke to some senior civil servants I know, and apparently these sorts of conversations are actually really common across all these networks. And civil servants, broadly speaking, think they have the perfect right to oppose policy if it is contrary to their values, if they disagree with it, they can seek to influence policy, and they think that's perfectly normal. And I think that's a very disturbing detail about the civil service more broadly. With Sami, though, he was suspended by the civil service when the story first came out, and then his defence, which was supported by the trade union, was that the transcripts were wrong, they were misrepresentative, and the investigation concluded with him being reinstated. But now, the Times, specifically Matt Dathan, who's a great journalist actually, have published the videos. They managed to get all the videos, they published them, and the videos show very clearly that the original reporting was 100% correct. The transcripts were accurate, and you can go and watch them, and I think they are worth watching, so you can see quite how clear this guy is about what he's seeking to do. And remember, this is on a fairly public Zoom call with hundreds of people attending, so goodness knows what he says in private. So this chap has now been suspended again, and the civil service is investigating again. And I think one of the most striking details for this is that he works for DEFRA, in human resources. So, notionally he should be all about upholding dignity for different groups, of ensuring there's no sort of discriminatory behaviour. And he, is very clearly saying things which I would imagine the typical Jewish civil servant hearing them would be appalled by. Because they do seem to be and sound intensely anti-Semitic.
And I suppose finally to tie these two things together, we've already seen a great effort by, the British state broadly to clamp down on the grooming gangs generally, and, not to deal with them, not to allow information about them to come out and all of this kind of thing. But that's generally by the British state, as it has been, from sort of woke, middle-class liberal hand-wringing. But so now could we be seeing perhaps similar sensibilities, but from a rather different direction of actually, that's my community doing this, and I don't want to hear, bad things said about them, so I'm going to cover it up for more ethnocentric reasons. I mean, it's quite worrying.
I think you could quite plausibly have a very dangerous alliance between, yes, the broadly speaking woke middle class liberal white civil servants, and maybe if there are Muslim civil servants who feel a particularly strong loyalty to faith or to their particular ethnic group or kin group, then yes, that could be quite dangerous. And I think it speaks broadly to the fact that we have a civil service, and have had since the Constitutional Reform and Government Act of 2010, in which the rules say that civil servants have a right to reject instructions from ministers if they think they break the civil service code. And this creates, I think, way too much leeway for civil servants to behave as a kind of administrative state without any democratic accountability.
Indeed. Okay, well, I think that's pretty much all we've got time for. David Shipley, thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you.
Now, just what happened last week in Ballymena, Northern Ireland? Why did the riots start? Why did they go on for so long? And what do they say about the fractious state of multicultural Britain and the possibility of more unrest? Well, to discuss that, I'm very pleased to be joined by Tom Jones, who's a writer and Conservative councillor. Welcome back to The Sceptic, Tom.
Thanks for having me on again, Laurie.
Yeah, good to have you here. So I suppose partly it's testament to the fact that it's been a very busy news week. I mean, it's been a terrible plane crash in India, war in the Middle East, and Baroness Casey's rapid audit into the grooming gangs, which has been a real bombshell. But this absolutely astonishing series of riots in Northern Ireland, starting in the town of Ballymena, has been almost ignored. I mean, there's been no national conversation about it in particular. And so, I mean, there's a lot to unpack here, Tom, but how did this start? And, I mean, it's developed into some quite shocking scenes over a number of days.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things I find most striking about Ballymena is the similarity with the Southport riots. So this is it was a riot by mostly white Northern Irelanders in this case, in protest against an alleged sexual assault by a migrant that basically turned into the rioters targeting successive refugee centres and areas where refugees were being housed and refugees' houses. It hasn't got as much attention as Southport. I think in a way that is to be expected because the events in Northern Ireland do not get as much attention as they do in Britain. And also rioting is a lot more common in Northern Ireland. It's much more par for the course than it is over here.
Yes, and so there are reasons for that, of course. But let's get into the specifics of why this started. So it was the alleged sexual offences by two Roma teenagers, it seems 14-year-olds, in Ballymena against a girl. That seemed to have sparked this, but of course it spread to other towns in Northern Ireland as well. And as you said, they are somewhat more used to rioting of this kind in Northern Ireland than they are in England, unlike the Southport riots. And it seems that they were actually rather more organised. And some of this has actually been really, really serious stuff. It's going to specific houses where asylum seekers or migrants are known to live and burning them down. And so it's, a very aggressively politicised point they are making here. And I mean, it does speak to these much wider problems about immigration and illegal migration in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, I think basically what has happened is that the institutional architecture of the Ulster groups, which has obviously in the past been used against Catholic populations and in response to the Catholic population, is obviously now being turned on migrants and is now being kind of utilised in order to fight the effects of migration. I think that's very interesting because I've just written a piece for CapX, subtle little plug, about neo-communalism. And I think that one of the interesting things about Ulster is that it shows a potential place for the rest of Britain to follow, because obviously that has been a communal society for a very long time that has had obviously two competing groups. And now part of the reason that the Ulster nationalists are protesting is that they are becoming an increasingly small majority and are therefore responding with a great deal of political apathy. So Aris Frassinos has written a fantastic piece that I recommend people read in Unheard about the riots, and he has noticed that, whereas formerly Stormont would have been something for the unionists to really kind of rally around as a symbol. They are now losing faith in that as well, and in Westminster, whereas obviously before the Ulster Unionists were really the flag bearers for Westminster rule in Northern Ireland. The support for the institutions around that are crumbling in direct response to them becoming a smaller and smaller minority, which is obviously being exacerbated not just by the increased birth rates of Catholics in Northern Ireland, but by a huge, huge influx of migrants, which have been placed overwhelmingly by Westminster government because of the low house prices in Northern Ireland. So obviously now you're seeing the kind of the architecture of previous communal conflicts being used against a new populational element that's coming in.
So illegal migration does seem to be playing a big part in this unrest. And it's quite a disturbing situation we're in now, isn't it? Where any time there's a particular crime like this, in this case it was an alleged sexual assault by two 14-year-olds of a girl. Last year in Southport, obviously, it was the horrific murder of children. Now that was not actually by an illegal migrant, though there were rumours that it was, but it was by someone with a migration background, of course. And all of these types of crimes, though, are being connected with the perception that, you know, immigration is causing these kinds of crimes to happen much more often, and that this is the government's fault. And so there's this bubbling public anger about this. And with that, it seems that we're close to kicking off over potentially anything.
It is. It's increasingly difficult, actually, to see a way out of this situation. I think it's actually quite frightening of what's happening to Britain. I think in the CapEx piece I wrote that in an ethnically mixed society, all political loyalties eventually devolve down to ethnicity. And I think the key part of that's a quote that's originally attributed to Lee Kuan Yew, but it probably didn't ever say it. But it does say something about his politics. But I think it says something about his politics because he recognised the futility of trying to flatten difference and pretend that they didn't exist. Whereas we haven't done that. We have been clinging to the idea of multiculturalism, that we are bringing in people who are just blank slates, who by a process of living on the magic soil and getting the magic piece of paper of their citizenship will suddenly become will suddenly hold British values by virtue of living in Britain and becoming British citizens. And it's simply not true. And the problem is with the phrase that in an ethnically mixed society, all political loyalties eventually devolve down to the ethnicity is the word all. So I make the case that there has been a massive upsurge in communal violence for non-white communities, which a lot of your readers will be familiar with. A reference, the Gaza riots, which eventually ended up in quite a lot of anti-Semitic violence. I also list the Black Lives Matter movement. There were the India-Pakistan riots over the cricket match a few years ago. There were real worries this summer that the war between India and Pakistan, which thankfully didn't blow up, that could have seen a massive, massive wave of violence in right across Britain, anywhere where there are large Pakistani and Indian communities living side by side. And I also make the point that, there was a spate of anti-Muslim violence in the wake of Lee Rigby. There were the riots following Southport, and there were Ballymena, and now the Ballymena riots. These are examples of exactly the same communal violence, but conducted by the white community. And it's increasingly hard to see a way out of this. David Betts, Professor David Betts, has just written a couple of pieces about the potential for civil war in Britain, which I'm not quite sure I agree that it will go so far as civil war, but I think we are certainly heading for, at worst, a significant civil breakdown. And I think, potentially this summer, going forward, there is the potential for the state to lose the monopoly on violence for large stretches of time in large areas of the country. And I think probably at best we are heading for a very, very different kind of Britain from the one that, even, people our age grew up in, where we are increasingly fractious, increasingly violent. And I think it's going to make a lot of people very, very, very uncomfortable. And it should.
And one of the things I think is really striking here is about how this exposes the fantasies of the left and the multiculturalists. And you see things like this in the Perec report, for instance, in the 2000s, where there's this idea that actually by increasing Britain's diversity, you will sort of dilute or erase the sense that Britishness is only about being white, and therefore everyone will sort of go forward together into a colourblind, multiracial utopia. But in fact, the exact opposite of that is what's happened. And in fact, there's been a reaction against that and an increasing identification by the white population with its own ethnic identity, or certainly from certain parts of it, and it's sort of viewing itself as more of an ethnic bloc. And I mean, it just shows how catastrophic this worldview is, that we're now seeing this, and how catastrophically wrong it was.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm in many such cases. I think one of the places this is probably going to end up in is that we are probably going to end up in a Michaelarized society. So the Michaela School is obviously, I think, Britain's strictest school, run by Catherine Birbalsingh, who a lot of your listeners will be very familiar with. And basically, the premise of the Michaela School, the Michaela formula, very successful formula, is that there is essentially no, I would say, expressions of group identity allowed whatsoever. So there are no prayers of any kind. There are no special meals. I think all the meals are vegetarian because it caters to all the different ethnic groups. It's obviously in a very ethnically diverse part of London. And there is, very, very little tolerance. It's incredibly strict as a school. And I think that kind of, we might call it immiserating convergence, is basically the formula that if Britain wants peace, it is going to have to follow. You will give yourself up for peace, but the worry is you might not even get that. We've followed this disastrous policy of multiculturalism, which has just completely failed contact with reality. We have groups living in Britain that very clearly despise us as a nation, not just, abstract terms of values or national history, but who hate us as a people. And it's very difficult to see how we coexist in the future with the ever increasing kind of hostility between ethnic groups of all kinds in this country without some kind of systemic breakdown in the country that we were.
And I'm interested in how you think the political consensus around this may change. So, of course, the response from the left, if it has covered the Ballymena riots at all, has been to denounce it and say, oh, this is racist, this is terrible, this shouldn't be happening, etc., etc. I mean, let's just hear an example.
If you've chosen this instance of a sexual assault to riot and to quote-unquote protest, quite a lot of women and girls have been attacked and abused by white Irish guys. Mm-hmm. And if you didn't do it then, but you're doing it now, you are quite literally a racist.
But it's sort of like, yes, obviously this is awful violence and it's a terrible shame that it's happening, but you can call it racist till the cows come home. That doesn't solve the issue, does it? So when will there be a recognition that the policies that brought us to this point need to be rethought? Or will it just be the same types of people saying forever, this is racist, and just making it more difficult to ever come to a sensible collective understanding of these issues?
I don't think so. I think for a long time yet, the left and core parts of the left. I actually think there's quite a lot of the blue Labour type tendency that seems to be slightly more important under Starmer than it was under previous iterations of Labour, that are kind of much more immigration sceptic. But I think there will always be a core of the left that considers scolding to be a solution when it comes to immigration, and that they can simply call a thing racist or call an act racist, and there ceases the problem, which it may or may not be true. It doesn't really matter, because it's not providing a solution to the issue. I think we're going to see a lot more racism in this country, if I'm being honest. I don't think it will just be from the white population at all. I think we are going to see it from all kinds of ethnic groups against all kinds of ethnic groups. We have, imported such a vast range of people that I think we are genuinely a melting pot of new and never before heard of ethnic tensions that, by geographical right, probably should not exist. But I don't think that will ever break through to a large section of the left, and I think that is because investigating the actual second-order consequences of immigration can often involve dealing with some quite impolite and it can involve dealing with some very impolite truths that do not make you particularly comfortable, particularly if you are a blank slatist. If you want to look at how the Labour Party is being influenced by Pakistani biradari networks, for instance, that takes you to some very difficult conclusions about, Pakistani, the influence of Pakistani men over women and things like this. And it really does challenge that blank slatist belief that everybody coming here is the same and that they live on the magic soil and they have the magic piece of paper and therefore they are British. And I also think that even looking at the consequences of migration, I think it is something that only bad people like you and I and our listeners do. And therefore I don't think they will ever cognitively engage with that second order consequences of migration.
And I think it's important not to lose sight of just how rapid and transformative this change has been. And so you reference Lee Kuan Yew a lot in your piece, the founding father of Singapore. And of course, he's got this famous anecdote where he comes to Britain in the 50s and he sees an honesty box in Piccadilly Circus for newspapers. And people are just putting their money in and taking a newspaper. And this to him is a wonderful example of a high trust society. And of course, now, as you've been saying, 70 years or so later, we're in this battle royale of ethnic conflict, essentially. And I mean, it's enormously sad that this change has happened in our country. It's such a huge change. And I mean, Tom, why did we do this to ourselves?
It is almost impossible to convey how much this country has changed in such a short space of time. We are, when America was labelled a nation of immigrants, it had a lower population of immigrants than Britain does right now. We can't even say that we are speedrunning this because nobody has ever run this path before. This is the biggest population change probably since the great migration of the Roman Empire, I would guess. Certainly in Europe. And the change in existing populations over the course of single lifetimes we just have absolutely no textbook for how this is done. And again, I think that's why it's leading us to some incredibly dangerous places, because this was an incredibly dangerous, stupid thing to do. The belief in the blank slate simply presumed that there would be a small amount of racism in the native population, but eventually this would be eradicated by simple exposure to the benefits of migration. Obviously, that was also predicated on the idea that there would be benefits to migration, which there are, but are massively overweighed by the downsides. Particularly, it must be said, for the people lower down the socio-economic scale. And I think this actually plays into a lot of the left's problem with migration. So overwhelmingly, the net negatives of immigration have been economic displacement for lower paid jobs, and things like increased crime. Now, those burdens fall overwhelmingly on people at the lower end of socioeconomic status in this country. And that therefore means that caring about them, and therefore suggesting that you feel the effects of those, actually becomes quite poor coded, and therefore very, very, very low status. So it becomes low status to care about these things, and therefore a high status signifier to say, well, I've never been affected by migrant crime, and I've never lost a job to a migrant. Because if you are if you are a hospital porter, you might have lost your job to a migrant who is, not paid less, but is certainly not going to be on the pay, not going to expect the same pay increases that you might. Whereas if you're, I don't know, working for Deloitte, then you won't lose your job to a migrant. And so I think that's part of the reason that will never break through to the left, because it is a socio-economic indicator of high status that you are unaffected by migration.
Yes, it's a good point. And so I'm keen to get your view on how this might develop this summer in particular, actually. So obviously these are huge trends, they're ongoing issues. But the question is, what will be the particular spark that might start some of this? And of course, we've had news this week from Baroness Casey's rapid audit into the grooming gangs that some of the ongoing police investigations into gang grooming, there's a, quote, significant proportion of the suspects are either asylum seekers or foreign nationals. Okay. And I mean, this is just an extraordinary revelation, it seems to me. And we know also that before this even came out, Downing Street was fretting about the possibility of civil unrest. But I mean, do you think that itself might cause that? But certainly it very much turns up the temperature, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely, it's going to. I think one of the worrying things about looking at Britain going forward is that it's actually very difficult to tell where the next point, where the next conflagration point is going to be. I mean, I would guess a lot of commentators have probably never heard of Southport and Ballymena. I must admit, I'd never heard of Ballymena until the riots. And I think that's one of the frightening things, is that it's very difficult to tell where these things are going to flare up. But I think a general rule of thumb is where there are high numbers of new arrivals, if they are being housed, if they are asylum seekers in particular, being housed in, let's say, something like a hotel, so in a kind of large area that makes it easier for people to notice what's going on, anywhere where there is probably a lower socioeconomic status community, which goes hand in hand with the hotels being there usually, because they're placed in low socioeconomic areas because it's to do with the cost of the hotel. Anywhere where there is a sexual assault committed by a member of the asylum seekers against a white girl, I think is a potential for a riot, and I think that is hundreds of places right across Britain, and I think it's absolutely terrifying. It feels like the government has bust riots basically right across the country, and I don't just think this should be a Labour thing. The Conservatives, frankly, are as to blame for this as anybody else for the situation that we're in. So I think it's incredibly hard to see how the government keeps hold of this. I can see what they're trying to do, which is they are trying to break up the hotel's estate. So that will reduce the overall number of hotels and disperse those asylum seekers into smaller areas, i.e. individual houses dotted throughout. So that makes, if there's not a big centre, that problem is slightly less likely to be noticed by everybody. But there will obviously still be large hotel centres. I also think that where sexual offences are committed by an asylum seeker, I think we will see a withholding of details by police forces in order to prevent riots. And I think where there are sexual assaults that aren't committed by asylum seekers, I think the police will actually release information almost straight away. And we've seen that already, right? Was it the Liverpool car driving into the Victory March in Liverpool? Within 24 hours, we knew the suspect's ethnicity, I think his name. And I think that was in large part because there was a lot of online speculation. Well, I think the police force said this actually, because there was a lot of online speculation, they released his name and his ethnicity to make it clear that he wasn't.
It was within 2 hours that we got his ethnicity.
Was it 2 hours? How long did we wait for the sample for?
Well, it took 4 days. 4 days.
Yeah. I think I think that is going to become the norm, basically. And so they are going to manage this problem with the withholding of information and dispersal of migrants to different parts of the country. And it's it's going to be a disaster.
And so the illegal migration problem is obviously the most visible here. And, the way these asylum hotels just keep popping up in people's communities in a way they don't want. And, it doesn't seem the government is doing a very good job on this. How could it start to solve the illegal migration problem, better than it currently is?
Well, the illegal migration problem, there are two separate problems here. So there's one which is how do you solve people's hostility to illegal migration? Which is primarily about the generous pull factors that bring them into this country. I remember seeing a video a while ago of a meeting in Stockport where people were told that migrants wouldn't place a burden on the NHS. And the person delivering it thought this was a great argument because he'd got these angry local residents saying, well, what about pressure on our local GP services? And he said, oh, no, don't worry about that. They won't place any pressure on your local GP services because we've taken them all private. And people feel that is, and it is. They don't just feel this. It is a complete ripping up of the social contract, the complete idea of the welfare state, that people pay in, and then when things are bad, they get out. So how it solves the illegal migration problem is basically addressing the pull factors first. So what the government is currently trying to do is smash the gangs, which is basically a way for Labour to talk about dealing with illegal migration without talking about dealing with illegal migration. So it says to reform voters, obviously they're very worried about reform now. It says to reform voters, we're doing something about illegal migration, don't you worry. We're going to smash the gangs. But equally, it says to the left, we're not criminalising individual migrants, we're dealing with it as a systemic problem and a criminal problem. So it allows them to ride, as my mother would say, two horses with one arse. But the problem is, as my mother often says, you can't ride two horses with one arse. And so fundamentally, no matter how many times you smash the gangs, the economic incentives are always the same. And as Charlie Munger says, if you show me the incentives, I'll show you the outcome. As long as the economic incentives that drag people here, that bring people to this country exist, there will always be gangs. Now, you might smash the current gangs, which I think are majority run by Kurds at the minute, and they will be replaced by Albanians. And if you smash the Albanian gangs, they will be replaced by different gangs. And if you smash those gangs, they will be replaced by different gangs. Because the economic incentives make it profitable for people to smuggle people from France to Britain. So what you fundamentally need to do is address the pull factors. That is, a rate of asylum acceptance that is way too generous across the board. Very, very difficult, making it very, very difficult to deport people. We've absolutely got to get deportations way, way up. Rupert Lowe will love to hear that. And you have to stop giving them such a generous welfare settlement when they get here. Now, there are technical things that you can do in terms of the actual channel crossings. So, you know, the French police, for how much money we're giving them, really aren't doing enough. However, to be fair to the French authorities, they are a transit country for these people. And, you know, there is probably an element of the French government that says, quite fairly, Britain wants these people so bad that they have this insane package of benefits for people to get there that makes the people come. And if we don't let them go to England, they just stay in France, so we'll let them go to England. So the idea that the French aren't policing the beaches is true, but a bit of a red herring. There are technical things you can do on smashing the gangs as well. So there are huge factories for the boats now running in, I think, near Istanbul, that are producing the boats that they're going across. You can disrupt those supply networks. You could throw quite a lot of money at places like Greece and Turkey to manage their border better and stop the migration flows. You could have, you know, maybe not done some interventions in Libya and kept that country stable so that they didn't have basically open access into the Mediterranean. I mean, one of the interesting things, if you look back at Tony Blair, one of the big reasons for his diplomatic pickup with Gaddafi after Lockerbie was migration flows, because Colonel Gaddafi actually kept very tight control on migration flows. And, you know, for all that he said and all that he did, there are now open slave markets in Libya because it's just an open port now for people smugglers from sub-Saharan Africa, all of Africa, in fact, just a funnel into the Mediterranean. And from there, people can go basically where they want. So there are a lot of things. I think one of the really big problems this year as well, we've seen a massive increase in the number of migrants coming over. That's not just to do with weather. We've had slightly better weather, which obviously increases the amount of channel crossings. We're also seeing a massive increase in number of people per boat. And part of the reason for that is that other nations in Europe are tightening up on immigration. They're becoming much more difficult to find asylum in. They're becoming much more hostile to legal immigration. And we are at the back of that loop. So other countries have moved forward and left us behind, and we are now the weakest link in the chain, to mix my metaphors. And therefore, we are probably now one of the most attractive places for migrants to come and live and work in Britain legally or illegally. And then, of course, it's actually quite easy to work illegally in this country. A lot of the gangs have basically forced people into modern slavery when they're over here. There are large factories that only employ illegal labour, particularly in, I think, the Midlands, in the West Midlands, sorry. And of course, you can just buy a Deliveroo account. So basically what the government needs to do first is address the pull factors that pull people to this country, break the chain of incentives that brings them here, and then deal with the resultant problem of the actual gangs themselves.
So as you say, the economic incentives are very important to look at here. But of course, another is, what the migrants can expect to happen to them when they arrive. And of course, the Rwanda plan under Rishi Sunak to send illegal migrants and asylum seekers to Rwanda to be processed. This was a very eye-catching policy. It was always denounced furiously by the left as being unbelievably cruel. And while it's true that not many were ever actually sent there, this does seem to have had quite a significant deterrent effect, actually. And because, of course, if you're expecting to be sent to Rwanda, you can't expect to be taking advantage of our unbelievably lax welfare and migration system generally.
Yeah, absolutely. So when Rwanda was really ramping up, there was actually a significant shift in migration flows towards the Republic of Ireland. And a lot of the increase in immigration we've seen in Northern Ireland is actually directed from the Republic northwards. But the problem, and that's all happened since Rwanda has been scrapped. Of course, there was a fundamental problem with Rwanda, which was it's not really compatible with the ECHR. And rather than actually get it through, obviously it was decided that we would abandon that scheme. But it was a massive deterrent to people. Now, not as big as it could have been if the flights had got off, but that was based on an idea that a lot of the policy that we saw under the Conservatives, the stop the boats, even the slogan itself, actually, was nicked wholesale from Australia. So under Malcolm Turnbull, they were having a lot of problems with, I think it was Indonesian arrivals coming over on boats into Australia. And so the government looked at what Turnbull had done and nicked a lot of that. Now, there were some daft ideas that didn't really work, like buying boats. We've taken, I think, to destroying boats rather than buying them. But the slogan we stole, a lot of advertising. I think we've picked that up as well. And the idea that there would be a deterrent scheme that meant new arrivals would never step foot on British or Australian soil was a big part of that. But the problem is, of course, that the Australians got it going and we didn't, because the Australians are not in the ECHR, which weirdly doesn't make them Nazis. But it's been so successful in Australia that actually, even though they've had changes of parties, they've stuck with the original plan. I think one of the things that really stuck in my mind when I read about this was there was a really striking poster of a very, very small boat in the middle of the ocean with the line, "You will not get to Australia." and I think it was very, very, very successful. But the problem is we picked it up piecemeal and we never forced it through. And because of that, because now essentially every element of that has been abandoned, there is no effective deterrent. Boats are not being interdicted. They are stepping foot on British soil. The asylum acceptance rates are extraordinarily high, some of the highest in Europe. And so there is no effective deterrent anymore of any kind.
I suppose one deterrent might be the riots. Well, Tom Jones, thank you very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Thanks for having me, Laurie.
Now, what's new in the world of our mad, green-obsessed elites? Well, to discuss that, I'm very pleased to be joined by Ben Pyle, journalist and Daily Sceptic regular. Welcome to The Sceptic, Ben.
Thanks, Laurie. Glad to be back.
Now, you're pretty prolific on this issue for us, Ben, but you've written this really interesting story this week about this idea of dimming the sun and the alarmism over it. Now, of course, a couple of months ago, we had a story about ARIA, this government quango, and its plans to dim the sun for so-called climate change reasons. Now, recently, we've been having this story that actually Britain's enemies, Russia, essentially, might try and dim the sun as some kind of geoengineering warfare against us. So it's strange. I mean, is this something that we want, or is it the worst thing ever if our enemies will inflict this on us? I mean, what's going on here? Which one is it? And I mean, is it really something we should be that concerned about? Last point first, no. And I'm sure we'll come on to that. I don't think there is a thing to worry about, and it causes much frustration with people when I say that, and this is one of the reasons I've written it. That's the end of the free part of the podcast. If you'd like to listen to the bonus interview, you'll need to become a regular donor to the Daily Sceptic. For as little as £5 a month, not only will you be able to watch or listen to the whole podcast, you'll also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion forum on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest content on the Daily Sceptic with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. Once you've become a donor, log in to the Daily Sceptic using the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Remember, you can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailysceptic.org/donate.